Internet. Welcome to Merlin's Archery Adventures with your host, Jim Grizzly Kent.
A little look at today is the arrow. Now, arrows come in all sorts of shapes and sizes, but chances are you'll be looking at either a wooden, aluminium or a carbon arrow. Now, this happens to be an Easton Axis trad carbon arrow, so it looks like wood, but it's actually made out of carbon. But the one thing all these arrows have in common is they have a spine, and that spine refers to how stiff the arrow is. And a general rule of thumb is the higher poundage of bow you're shooting, the stiffer the arrow needs to be. Now, it's a common misconception that you can just pick up any bow and any arrow and go out shooting. It's very important that you have the right arrows for that bow. Now, one way of doing that is looking at an arrow chart. And an arrow chart works by, it plots your rough spine range based upon the length of arrow and draw length that you've got and the poundage of bow. And that gives you a good indication of what sort of spine you'll be going to. But your best bet is to come and see one of us at the shop and we can make sure that we get the right arrows for you. But what we really want to know is, how does the arrow work and how does the spine affect that? Now, when you shoot an arrow, now I shall tell you this for free, I've heard a lot of people say, oh, firing an arrow. You don't fire an arrow, you shoot an arrow or you loose an arrow. But that's just a little bit of a tidbit for you, but we'll go into that at a later date. But what you do when you shoot your arrow, the arrow goes into something called the archer's paradox. Now, what happens is when you're at full draw and you loose that arrow, there's a lot of pressure coming from behind the arrow. So what will happen? Now, bear in mind, I'm explaining this from a right-handed point of view. If you're left-handed, the whole process is reversed. But I'll talk about it from a right-handed point of view because I'm right-handed and it's a little bit easier. But what will happen is when you shoot your bow, you've got a lot of pressure on the back of the arrow. So what will happen? It will bend round the riser. And if it's the right spine, it will bend round the riser and then flex back just enough to carry the arrow straight down range. Now, it's another Hollywood misconception that arrows fly perfectly straight. Arrows don't fly perfectly straight. They flex as they fly, certainly for the first portion of flight anyway, but they flex as they fly. So what's happening there is, as it's bending around the riser and flexing straight, it's straightening up nice. Those fletchings and feathers will kick in and carry the arrow nice and straight, and that's if the arrow is the right spine. So it will flex back just enough to carry it straight. Now, what happens if you shoot an arrow that's too stiff? Now, same thing will happen. You're putting a lot of pressure on the back of the arrow, so it will bend around the riser again, bend around to the right, but as the arrow is incredibly stiff, it will flex back too much this time. So instead of flexing back the right amount to come straight, it'll flex back way too much, and you'll end up with arrows on the left-hand side of your target. Now, also, it's very similar with what happens if you shoot an arrow that is too weak for your bow. Now, this is where you need to be very careful. If you shoot an arrow that is drastically too weak, chances are the arrow could explode, shatter, go everywhere and cause a lot of damage, and you don't want that. So it's very important, especially at the higher poundage bows, not to shoot an arrow that is too weak for your bow, because you could end up in a real mess. But what will happen if you are a couple of spine ranges too weak is the arrow again will bend around the riser. It will bend around the riser to the right. And instead of straightening up, instead of using the spine's, the stiffness of the spine to straighten up, obviously that stiffness isn't there, so it will carry on bending round and end up with the arrows stuck in the right-hand side of the target. So that's essentially what's happening with your arrows. If they're too stiff, they'll bend round and flex back too much and hit the left side. If they're too weak, they'll bend round and they won't flex back enough and they'll hit the right side. But if they're right, just about right, they'll bend around and it'll flex back just the right amount and carry your arrow nice and straight. Well, if you do want to see a good representation of the Archer's Paradox, check out Disney's Brave. That has probably one of the best representations of the Archer's Paradox in it in Hollywood, and that's a cartoon. Well, anyway, I hope you have found that useful. You take care, shoot straight, and I will see you on the internet. Bye-bye.
Side of the bow. If you're shooting Easton style with a thumb and forefinger release or even a thumb ring, the arrow goes on the right side of the bow.